Gentleman yields back. Mr. Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Turley, I want to direct these first few questions to you. The other three witnesses have identified this amorphous standard for impeaching a president. They've said that if a president abuses his power for personal or political gain, it's impeachable conduct. You agree with me?
Not the way it's been stated. In fact, there's so many different standards.
I got a long ways to go here.
Well, there's been so many different standards. One of them was attempting to abuse office.
Okay.
I'm not even sure how to recognize that, let alone define it.
So let me go with a few examples and see if you agree with me. Lyndon Johnson directed the Central Intelligence Agency to place a spy in Barry Goldwater's campaign. That spy got advanced copies of speeches and other strategy, delivered that to the Johnson campaign. Would that be impeachable conduct according to the other panelists?
Oh, well, it sweeps pretty broadly, so I assume so.
How about when President Johnson put a wiretap on Goldwater's campaign plane? Would that be for political benefit?
Well, I can't exclude anything under that definition.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go with a few other presidents. We'll see where we go. Congressman Deutsch just informed us that FDR put country first. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he was president, directed the IRS to conduct audits of his political enemies, namely Huey Long, William Randolph Hearst, Hamilton Fish, Father Coughlin. Would that be an abuse of power for political benefit, according to the other panelists? Would that be impeachable conduct?
I think it all would be subsumed into it.
How about when President Kennedy directed his brother, Robert Kennedy, to deport one of his mistresses as an East German spy? Would that qualify as impeachable conduct?
Once again, I can't exclude it.
And how about when he directed the FBI to use wiretaps on congressional staffers who opposed him politically? Would that be impeachable conduct?
It would seem to be falling within it.
And let's go to Barack Obama. When Barack Obama directed or made a finding that the Senate was in recess and appointed people to the National Labor Relations Board and lost 9-0, Ruth Bader Ginsburg voted against the president on this issue. Would that be an abuse of power?
I'm afraid you have to direct it to others, but I don't see any exclusions under their definition.
Okay, and how about when the president directed his national security advisor and the Secretary of State to lie to the American people about whether the ambassador to Libya was murdered as a result of a video or was murdered as a result of a terrorist act? Would that be an abuse of power for political benefit 17 days before the next election?
Well, not according to my definition. The others will have to respond to their own.
Well, you've heard their definition. You can apply those facts to their definition.
I have a hard time excluding anything out of something.
How about when Abraham Lincoln arrested legislators in Maryland so that they wouldn't convene to secede from the Union? And Virginia already had seceded, so it would have placed Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, in the middle of the rebellion. Would that have been an abuse of power for political benefit?
Well, it could be under that definition.
And you mentioned George Washington a little while ago as perhaps having met the standard of impeachment for your other panelists. In fact, let me ask you something, Professor Turley. Can you name a single president in the history of the United States, save President Harrison, who died 32 days after his inauguration, that would not have met the standard of impeachment for our friends here?
I would hope to God James Madison would escape. Otherwise, a lifetime of academic work would be shredded. Once again, I can't exclude many of these acts.
Isn't what you and I and many others are afraid of is that the standard that your friends to the right of you, and not politically, but to the right of you sitting on there, that your friends have decided that the bar is so low that when we have a Democrat president in office and a Republican House and a Republican Senate, we're going to be going through this whole scenario again in a way that really puts the country at risk.
Thank you. Well, when your graphic says in your ABCs that your B is betrayal of national interest, I would simply ask, do you really want that to be your standard?
Now, isn't the difference, Professor Turley, that some people live in an ivory tower and some people live in a swamp? And those of us that are in the swamp are doing our very best for the American people,
Well,
but it's not pretty.
Actually, I live in an ivory tower in a swamp because I'm at GW, but, and it's not so bad.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the witnesses, and I don't believe that People's House is a swamp. President Nixon was impeached for abuse of power because his conduct was, quote, undertaken for his personal political advantage and not in furtherance of any valid national policy objective. President Gerhardt, why was it significant that President Nixon acted for his personal political advantage and not in furtherance of any valid national policy objective?
It's primarily significant because in acting for his own personal benefit and not for the benefit of the country, he has crossed a line. The line here is very clear, and it becomes abuse of power when somebody's using the special authorities of their office for their own personal benefit and not the benefit of the country.
So can the same be said of President Trump?
It could be, yes. Yes.
Well, thank you. You know, I'm struck by the parallels because one of the things that Nixon did was he launched tax investigations of his political opponents. Here, the evidence shows Trump tried to launch a criminal investigation of his political opponent by a foreign government. We have heard evidence suggesting that President Trump did this for his own personal gain and not for any national policy interest. Although President Trump claims that he withheld the aid because of concerns about corruption, I do believe that we have example of the evidence of the truth.
Ambassador Sondland stated that the president only cares about big stuff. Big stuff. I noted there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia. And Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing.
What would the framers have thought of a president who only cares about the, quote, big stuff that benefits him?
The framers were extremely worried about a president who served only his own interests or the interests of foreign powers. That was their most serious concern when they designed the remedy of impeachment.
So the evidence also suggests that President Trump didn't even care if the investigation actually happened. What he really cared about was the public announcement of the investigation. So, Professor Carlin, how do we analyze these facts in the context of abuse of power?
Well, I think that to have a president ask for the investigation of his political opponents is an archetype of the abuse of power. And, you know, Mr. Buck mentioned past examples of this. And to say that those weren't impeachable, I think, is a big mistake. If a president wiretaps his opponents, that's a federal crime now. I don't know whether before the Wiretap Act of 1968 it was. But if a president wiretapped his opponents today, that would be impeachable conduct.
I also serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I understand how significant it is to foreign leaders to meet with our presidents. To attend a meeting in the Oval Office is very significant. President Zelensky is a newly elected head of state in a fledgling democracy. His country is at war with his neighbor. Russia invaded and is occupying his country's territory. He needed the military resources to defend his country. He needed the diplomatic recognition of the American president, and he was prepared to do whatever the president demanded. Many years ago, I worked in the nation's largest trauma unit as a PA, a physician assistant. I saw people at their worst in severe pain after accidents or acts of violence. Patients I took care of were desperate and afraid and had to wait 5 to 8 hours to be seen. Can you imagine for 1 minute if I had told my patients, look, I can move you up in line and take care of your pain, but I do need a favor from you, though. My patients were in pain and they were desperate, and they would have agreed to do anything I asked. This would have been such an abuse of my position because of the power dynamic. I had the power to relieve my patients from experiencing pain. It's fundamentally wrong and in many cases illegal for us to use power to take advantage of those in crisis, especially a president, especially when lives are at stake. I yield back.